May 16, 1943, Lincolnshire. The night air thrums with the sound of Rolls-Royce Merlin engines at full throttle. 19 Lancaster bombers sit on the runway at RAF Scampton, their bellies carrying a weapon so utterly improbable that German intelligence refused to believe the reports. 4 tons of spinning, bouncing metal designed by a man who'd taught himself aeronautics from first principles. In the cockpit of Lancaster AJ-G, 21-year-old pilot Joe McCarthy checks his instruments one final time. Beside him sits the bomb aimer, Bob Hay, staring at the strange cylindrical object hanging beneath the fuselage like some steampunk carnival contraption. They're about to attempt something that ought to be impossible. Within 4 hours, they would either become heroes or casualties. What they were carrying that night would change the course of the war in ways that still baffle military historians today. This is the story of how a ridiculous idea became one of the most audacious military operations ever conceived, and why a single weapon that nobody believed in would reshape the technological landscape of modern warfare forever. The problem facing the Allies in early 1943 was as profound as it was seemingly insoluble. Across the Ruhr Valley in occupied Germany lay the Möhne, Eder, and Sorpe dams. These weren't mere obstacles to military operations. They were the jugular vein of German industrial production. The reservoirs behind those dams provided water to cool the furnaces producing steel, aluminium, and munitions. They powered hydroelectric stations, supplying electricity to factories working round the clock to manufacture weapons. The dams irrigated the farms, producing food for a nation under siege. One intelligence assessment suggested that destroying these 3 dams would reduce German steel production by 23%. Given the state of the war in spring 1943, when German forces still held vast territories and the Allies faced uncertain prospects in both Europe and the Pacific, that figure wasn't merely significant, it was potentially war-winning. The difficulty was the dams themselves. The Möhne Dam rose 43 meters from its foundations, a vast curve of reinforced concrete that had been engineered with precisely this threat in mind. Its walls sloped inward, thickening towards the base in a configuration specifically designed to resist conventional bombing. The Germans had positioned anti-aircraft batteries all around the perimeter. The approaches were heavily defended. Previous attempts to destroy dams using conventional high-explosive bombs had failed dismally. Bombs would crater the surrounding earth, but the dams themselves stood firm. Standard armor-piercing bombs, when they hit the water, would simply sink harmlessly to the bottom. Conventional aerial attacks in daylight would be suicide against the concentrated flak defenses. What was needed was something entirely different, something that could be deployed at low level, in darkness, with enough precision to place a weapon of sufficient power exactly where it mattered most. By early 1943, such a weapon existed only in the imagination of one man. His name was Barnes Wallis, and he had already achieved fame for designing the Vickers-Wellington bomber that had served the RAF with distinction since 1936. But Wallis was not a man to rest on his accomplishments. He was that rarest of wartime creatures, an engineer who imagined possibilities where others saw only constraints. Wallis was working at the Vickers-Armstrongs facility in Weybridge when the concept came to him, though the precise moment of inspiration remains disputed by historians. What is beyond question is that he began experimenting with a revolutionary principle. What if, instead of trying to smash through a dam wall with brute force, you could place a weapon against the dam's face in such a way that the water pressure itself would amplify the effect of the explosion? The difficulty was delivery. A bomb dropped from altitude would penetrate too deep into the water. A bomb dropped from low level would be difficult to aim with precision. Wallis's solution was audacious in its simplicity. He would make the bomb bounce. The physics involved were complex, but the principle was elegant. If you spun a large cylindrical bomb backwards whilst dropping it from a fast-moving aircraft flying at a low altitude parallel to the dam, The backspin would cause it to skip across the water surface like a stone skimmed across a pond, just as generations of children had done in rivers and lakes across Britain. The bomb would bounce multiple times, each bounce slowing its forward progress until it struck the dam wall with its spin gradually unwinding, causing it to roll down the face of the dam until it reached the base. There, nestled against the concrete, it would detonate with the full force of its 6 tons of explosive charge. Wallace constructed scale models and tested them in a tank at the Road Research Laboratory in Harmondsworth, just outside London. He filled the tank with water and adjusted his test bomb's size, spin rate, and shape dozens of times. He calculated precisely what weight and shape would give the correct bouncing characteristics. He consulted with the Admiralty. He performed mathematical calculations that consumed months of work. The weapon that emerged from this process was a cylinder 6 meters in length, weighing 4,250 kilograms, containing 2,944 kilograms of explosive. It was manufactured at Woolwich Arsenal and Vickers Armstrong's facilities, with the components transported by road to Lincoln's Central Weapons Depot. Fewer than 100 of these weapons were ever manufactured. Exact production figures remain classified, but estimates suggest the total reached approximately 120 units. Whatever the precise number, every single one was being assembled with the utmost care and secrecy as the summer of 1943 approached. The operational plan had been formulated by Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris, the austere commander of RAF Bomber Command. Harris selected Wing Commander Guy Gibson to lead the mission. Gibson was already a decorated pilot with 72 operational sorties to his name, yet he had never encountered anything quite like this. The selected crews underwent intensive training over the English lakes, flying at exactly 60 feet altitude at precisely 260 kilometers per hour, releasing inert test weapons until the technique became second nature. The navigation would be dead reckoning through the moonlit night, with the bombers flying just above the tree line to avoid German radar. The lake crossings would be the Möhne first, where the primary target waited beneath the dark Ruhr sky. Gibson's Lancaster was to make the first attack, releasing its bouncing bomb from precisely 60 feet above the water, with the bomb spinner wound up to 540 revolutions per minute by a small hydraulic motor. The bomb would drop into the water, bounce 3 times, strike the dam wall, and settle at its base. What happened when Gibson released his bomb at 00:28 hours on May 17, 1943, has been described as the most perfect technical demonstration of a theoretical concept ever achieved in wartime. The bomb bounced exactly as Wallace's calculations predicted. It struck the dam wall and rolled down towards the base. The explosion that followed shattered the night sky. Water erupted in a column that reached nearly 200 meters into the air. The Möhne Dam, which had stood intact through years of war, burst with catastrophic violence. Within seconds, a torrent of approximately 300 million tons of water was cascading down the Ruhr Valley. The attack on the Eder Dam followed similarly successful results. The bombers turned for home as dawn began to break, their mission accomplished in less than 20 minutes of actual bombing. Of the 19 aircraft dispatched, 16 returned to England. 56 aircrew had been lost. If you're finding this interesting, a quick subscribe to the channel helps more than you know, and it genuinely does make a difference to what we can produce next. The destruction caused by the 2 successful dam breaches was measured in terms of absolute devastation. The flooding destroyed bridges, roads, power facilities, and factories across an area extending 15 kilometers downstream. Estimates of the German war production losses varied dramatically depending on the source. Conservative Allied assessments suggested perhaps 7% reduction in war production. More aggressive estimates approached Wallace's original 23% figure, though these were likely inflated. Yet the German response was telling. Within weeks, the Wehrmacht had ordered the construction of anti-bounce nets and booms across every significant German dam. They deployed additional anti-aircraft batteries. They reinforced the walls themselves. They were treating the bouncing bomb threat with extraordinary seriousness. The Americans, witnessing the success of Operation Chastise, attempted to develop their own equivalent weapon. The result was the British-influenced Tallboy bomb, a streamlined, penetrating bomb designed by Wallace that would sink deep into its target before detonating. The Germans characteristically attempted to develop countermeasures that became almost as elaborate as the weapon itself. Other nations filed away the principle for future use. The bouncing bomb technique, whilst never employed again in quite the same manner during the Second World War, had demonstrated a principle that would echo through military history. Technological audacity, backed by rigorous mathematical analysis and meticulous execution, could achieve what brute force alone could not. The actual impact of Operation Chastise remains contested among historians, which itself is telling. In the immediate term, the dam breaches caused genuine disruption to German industry and civilian infrastructure. The death toll from flooding was estimated at between 1,600 and 2,600 civilians, alongside several thousand deaths among forced laborers. Materially, the impact on German war production has been debated endlessly. Some historians argue the psychological impact exceeded the material one. German engineers rebuilt the dams within months. Steel and aluminium production continued, albeit at reduced capacity. Yet the operation demonstrated something crucial at a critical moment in the war. It showed that the Allies possessed not only superior industrial capacity but also superior innovation. It showed that precision, intelligence, and calculated risk could overcome defenses that seemed impregnable. It provided a propaganda victory at a time when such victories mattered profoundly. The newsreels of Operation Chastise circulated throughout the Allied world. The bravery of the air crews was celebrated in every newspaper. In a war that had thus far seen the Allies struggling against German military superiority in nearly every theater, here was a victory that belonged entirely to British ingenuity and British courage. The dam buster crews became icons. No subsequent raid, no matter how successful, quite captured the public imagination in the same manner. The operation vindicated Harris's faith in precision bombing despite the skepticism of the Admiralty and the American military establishment. Later, historians would regard Operation Chastise as the pinnacle of RAF Bomber Command's technical achievements, a mission that demonstrated the service was capable of far more sophisticated operations than the terror bombing campaigns for which it would later become infamous. In the context of 1943, when Allied fortunes remained uncertain and German military capabilities seemed inexhaustible, Operation Chastise provided a glimmer of something precious, the possibility of victory through intelligence and precision rather than merely through attrition. The bouncing bomb itself, that ridiculous cylindrical contraption that nobody believed would work, became a testament to the power of refusing conventional wisdom. Barnes-Wallis had designed it not because military headquarters demanded it, but because he had perceived a problem that ought to be unsolvable and had determined to solve it anyway. The RAF had trained crews to deliver it not because they were confident it would function, but because the theoretical calculations suggested it might. The crews had flown the mission not because they were certain of success, but because they were asked to attempt the impossible, and they possessed the skill and bravery to make the attempt. What emerged from that convergence of vision, mathematical rigor, training, and courage was one of the most audacious military operations ever executed. When Wing Commander Guy Gibson returned to Scampton that dawn, his Lancaster bearing the scars of anti-aircraft fire and flak that had cost him a young aircrew member, he knew that something extraordinary had occurred. The German forces occupying Fortress Europe had received notice that they were no longer invulnerable. The dams that had seemed eternal now lay breached. The factories they powered would work at reduced capacity. Most profoundly, the confidence that German engineering and German defensive preparation were sufficient to withstand Allied assault had been dealt a blow from which it would never fully recover. A ridiculous invention, deployed with mathematical precision and human courage, had opened a crack in the German war machine. That crack would widen in the months and years ahead. In the grand calculation of the war, Operation Chastise was a single raid, memorable but ultimately tactical rather than strategic. Yet in the annals of military innovation, in the history of how technology intersects with human bravery, in the record of what is possible when genius is combined with precision, Operation Chastise stands as perhaps the finest example of the principle that the truly ridiculous and the truly brilliant are often separated merely by the willingness to attempt what others consider impossible.